Mallard Company has a peculiar rule. Employees must push a millstone in a secret room for 8 hours each day. Even if their legs are trembling with fatigue, they dare not relax even a bit, because if they fail to complete the task, they might be sent to the afterlife with a single injection. Even if they do complete the task, they cannot be the last one to finish, or the result is the same, and their daily wage is just a sandwich and a bottle of water. When Joe heard about this, he was furious. He had applied to be the boss's secretary, so why was he locked up here for no reason? At that moment, a screen on the wall suddenly lit up. The AI informed him that today he must push the millstone 50 times, or he would be fired. Joe was delighted when he heard this, as he had long wanted to leave this lousy company. But just then, a colleague next door suddenly reminded Joe that he had better complete the task honestly, or the consequences would be unimaginable. Joe thought the worst that could happen was getting fired, but when Joe heard the horrific screams around him, he realized what fired meant. Joe hurried to the millstone. He hadn't expected the millstone to be so heavy. Even with all his strength, it wouldn't budge an inch. Then Joe shook out his hands and rolled up his sleeves. He couldn't believe that his 200-pound body couldn't even push a millstone. Yet, the millstone remained as steady as a rock. The time limit was about to expire. Joe mustered all his strength, and this time, he finally managed to push the millstone. But it wasn't over yet. He had to push the millstone 50 full turns to complete the task. However, as a reward for the first turn, the AI gave Joe a special drink, and so, Joe officially became a member of the company. The days passed one by one, and Joe became more and more proficient, even doubling his daily task completion. Little did he know, this very action would lead to a devastating disaster for his colleagues in the future. As a reward for exceeding his work quota, Joe received twice as much food and water as the others. However, many of his colleagues couldn't even meet the basic quota. Every night, Joe could hear their screams, which meant he never had a peaceful night's sleep. Although Joe had been pushing the millstone for over 6 months, his weight had not changed at all. But these were minor concerns. When the colleague next door found out that Joe's daily quota was 100 turns, he was astonished. The colleague believed that Joe was specially recruited by the company, and if Joe continued like this, it would inevitably lead to a big problem, because once the company realized that employees' limits were far beyond 50 turns, they would likely increase everyone's workload. He quickly told Joe that he only needed to complete a little more than the basic quota each day and avoid being the last one. The most important thing was to never reveal his daily quota to anyone. Otherwise, if someone knew, they would push 2 more turns than him, making Joe the last one. Joe understood this very well, but whenever he thought of his pregnant wife at home, he was filled with motivation. He broke his record again, completing 150 turns. Just then there was a knock on the door of his room, and the staff told him to come to the door at once. Joe immediately began to panic. He had clearly exceeded his task, so why was he being fired? But the staff ignored him completely, only shouting for Joe to get over there immediately. Then they told Joe to take off all his clothes. Faced with their demands, Joe was confused but had no choice but to comply. Soon, Joe was completely naked. Then they opened the door. Being trapped here for so long, being able to leave should have been good news. But Joe felt no joy at all, because Joe didn't know what was waiting for him. Just as he stepped out, a machine in front of him suddenly sprayed water. In the next second, the staff threw him a bar of soap. It turned out that the reward for completing 150 turns was a shower. After the shower, Joe thought for a long time. Could it be that the more turns he completed, the better the rewards? Maybe he could even regain his freedom. Thinking of this filled Joe with energy, and he immediately completed 370 turns. Then he sat down, satisfied, to rest. He thought to himself, he's exceeded his quest by 6 times. He must be able to get out of here. Just as Joe was dreaming of freedom, the AI began to speak. Soon, a staff member handed him a box from the door. With some curiosity, Joe opened it, only to find a pen inside. The AI told him that this was not an ordinary pen. Upon closer inspection, Joe saw that it indeed was special, but he couldn't help but feel disappointed by the reward. After all his hard work completing 370 turns, receiving just a pen made him furious, and he started yelling at the AI. "What use is a pen? Do you expect me to study hard and make progress every day?" But after venting his anger, Joe regretted it. Unexpectedly, the AI immediately changed Joe's daily quota to 370 turns. The AI stated that as an employee, One must dare to challenge their limits at work. The company was optimistic about him and recognized his efforts more than others. After his initial rage subsided, Joe realized he had no choice but to accept his fate. As the familiar music played, Joe threw himself back into work. But soon he noticed something was wrong. He had clearly completed a turn, but the computer screen still displayed 0. He wanted to ask why, but the AI ignored him. Just then, his colleague next door spoke up. Upon learning about Joe's situation, he immediately understood that Joe was being punished. The little cross on the screen meant that Joe had to push the millstone 2 turns for it to count as 1. In other words, he now had to complete double the work. 740 turns. Joe couldn't understand why he was being punished. Was it just because he had yelled at the AI? But for now, he had no choice but to comply with the company's demands. Completing 740 turns was no easy task. As Joe lay down to rest, he suddenly noticed a name carved on the millstone's wooden post, Alex. Joe shared this discovery with his colleague. To his surprise, the colleague was astonished. Alex was a legend in this place. He was the only person who had ever escaped from the company. Joe found it hard to believe. This place was surrounded by impenetrable walls. How could Alex have escaped? If it was true, then whose skeleton had he seen? Joe wanted to ask more about how Alex had escaped, but his colleague stopped talking to him. Just then, the AI beeped. It was already 10 p.m., and Joe still hadn't completed his 740 turn quota. To help Joe complete his work, the company decided to assign him a new colleague. That new colleague was Joe's pregnant wife. Joe immediately panicked and pleaded with the AI not to do this. His wife was pregnant and couldn't possibly do this kind of work. He promised he would meet the daily quota from now on. To his surprise, the AI agreed to Joe's request. As long as Joe completed 740 turns on time tomorrow, the punishment would be lifted. But today's unfinished work still required a penalty. A huge triangular grill descended above Joe's head. The punishment was to make Joe push the 740 turns in a 50-degree environment. Joe knew that this company had no humanity left. If he stayed here, he would eventually lose his life. He might even put his wife and child at risk. He decided he had to find a way to escape. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Joe was woken up by the AI. To prevent his wife from being brought in, Joe was determined to complete the task today, no matter what, with thoughts of his wife in his mind. Joe gritted his teeth and completed the 740 turns. The company's punishment was lifted. They even rewarded Joe. The reward was seeing his wife and child. Joe was confused. He remembered his wife had only been pregnant for a little over 6 months. How had she already given birth? He knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had to find a way to escape. If Alex's legend was true, there had to be a way out of this place. At that moment, the colleague next door finally revealed that Alex had escaped by digging a tunnel through the wall, because he also had a wife and child. He could understand Joe's situation, and he hoped Joe could successfully escape to reunite with his family. Upon hearing this, Joe immediately started looking around. Sure enough, he soon noticed a spot that seemed to have been patched up. And this spot was in a blind spot of the camera. Alex must have dug the tunnel from here to escape, but Joe didn't have any suitable tools on hand. Then he suddenly remembered the pen, so he got to work. In the days that followed, Joe spent his time either completing his daily tasks or chiseling at the wall. Day by day, the hole grew larger. Joe also grew stronger, and completing 370 turns became easier for him. Finally, after 6 months, Joe managed to break through the tunnel. He eagerly crawled in. Joe thought he would soon leave this dreadful place, but as soon as he emerged, he encountered a guard. When Joe woke up again, the tunnel entrance had been sealed. As Joe cried out in despair, the AI's voice came through, informing him that his daily quota had been increased to 1,000 turns as punishment for attempting to escape. His neighbor was also implicated, and his legs were broken. Moreover, everyone else had to complete 1,000 turns each day, just like Joe. Hearing this, everyone immediately started yelling at Joe. Because of Joe, everyone was being punished. Ignoring everyone's ire, Joe rushed over to ask about his neighbor's injuries. To his surprise, his neighbor didn't blame him. Instead, he revealed another secret. All the work here was based on computer algorithms. He had helped create the AI for the company, but he hadn't expected the AI to develop new algorithms during the process, making the survival rules increasingly harsh. The neighbor shared this because he believed Joe could find a way to break the AI's rules. Since Joe had arrived, everything had changed. Originally, Everyone completed just enough work to meet the task targets for survival, but when Joe arrived, he kept pushing human limits and creating miracles, which caused the AI to keep changing the rules. Joe suddenly thought, since all their work was based on algorithms, what if everyone stopped working? The AI wouldn't be able to calculate anything. More importantly, this way, there would be no last place, and no one would die. The colleague next door agreed that in theory, it could work, but warned that the AI could quickly adapt and find a way to counteract the loophole. Joe felt they should at least give it a try, so he immediately shared his plan with everyone. Where there is oppression, there will be resistance. Naturally, they chose to believe in Joe, uniting together to resist the AI. Once the plan was set, Joe relaxed and waited for the 10 p.m. assessment. Unexpectedly, for minutes before the assessment, the AI abruptly changed the rules. Any employee with a score of 0 would be fired. Joe was unconcerned at first, but then he heard the sound of millstones being pushed. He rushed to stop them. No matter how much Joe tried to persuade them, no one seemed willing to stop. Under the company's long-term oppression, they had lost their will to fight for freedom. The colleague next door understood Joe's frustration. He had also tried to break the rules but ended up being dragged back like a dog. Watching the countdown on the screen, Joe resigned himself to his fate and stripped down once more to accept his cruel destiny. Joe sighed in resignation. At that moment, he realized that as someone from the bottom rung, he didn't even have the right to resist. How could he complete 1,000 turns in the remaining 2 minutes? Seeing the time come to 10 o'clock, Joe felt neither anger nor the urge to curse. He knew this was his ultimate fate. Afterward, he had a long conversation with his colleague. They were both calm. Without complaints or accusations, they silently awaited their impending death.
Farewell, my friend.
The hurried sound of the door opening was next, and his colleague was taken first. Joe clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the harrowing screams, but it didn't matter. His turn would come soon. Before that, as a reward for being an exemplary employee, the AI allowed Joe to watch a video of his wife and child. To his surprise, in just half a year, his child could already walk. Seeing this, Joe couldn't hold back any longer and began to vent his endless fury at the AI. But as the door opened, everything fell silent. In the next second, many men and women entered the room. They wore white shirts and held tablets. No matter how much Joe yelled at them, they remained silent. Until the door opens again, a guard appeared at the doorway, whistling as he walked in. He carried a metal tray, which he skillfully handed to one of the staff members. Then, without a word, the guard put on gloves and took out a prepared syringe. The guard seemed to do this kind of work many times a day. Thinking of his wife and child, Joe refused to sit back and wait for his fate. He charged at the guard, unleashing a year's worth of suppressed anger with his fists. The people around him didn't try to stop him. Instead, they had strange smiles on their faces. Maybe they were finally seeing someone dare to break the rules here. The bloodied guard encouraged Joe to go ahead and do it. It turned out that all of this was part of an interview. The company used this experiment to test each employee's abilities. Clearly, Joe's performance impressed them. Not only did he demonstrate excellent leadership, but he also dared to innovate and break the rules. The leadership immediately offered Joe a manager position. Joe now had a private office, and his job was very simple, just sitting there watching videos. He was also provided with accommodation and 3 meals a day. And most importantly, he had full benefits. After the leader left, Joe immediately called his wife. But when Joe heard the artificial intelligence voice on the phone, he realized that it was far from over. He was still part of the experiment. Only now he had been promoted from an ordinary employee to a manager.